This was the most scared I have ever been as a nurse. So back in 2009, I had just graduated from nursing school as a registered nurse. And I had been working at the hospital in my hometown as a nurse's aide in the emergency department while I tried to figure out what it was I wanted to do. So I was familiar with this old hospital, and again, I had worked there for years at this point prior to the incident. And this hospital, it was old. It was one of those hospitals that has been around for like 100 years, and everybody has a creepy story about it. And I remember when I was younger, my friend's dad used to tell us this creepy ghost story about a time when he had surgery at the hospital, and while he was there recovering, he got visited in the middle of the night by a doctor, and then the next morning went to check with the staff, and that doctor had died the previous day, like a typical dad ghost story. So anyway, when I started working at the hospital as a nurse's aide, I worked in the emergency department and I loved it. I loved the people that I worked with, and we just always had a ton of fun. And because it was an old, creepy hospital, we were always swapping ghost stories or weird incidents that you heard third hand. But like any other hospital, because of staffing shortages, occasionally some of us would have to stay and work the night shift. While I never actually saw anything, I would always get spooked out when I'd have to go into the basement by myself in the middle of the night and get stuff out of the creepy supply closet to bring back up. But again, I never actually experienced anything. Yet. After I decided I wanted to go back to school and get my nursing degree, I knew that I wanted to come back and work at this hospital. One, because it was in my hometown, and two, I really enjoyed the people that I worked with in the ER, and that's where I wanted to work. But my hospital had a policy, and any new graduate nurse had to start and complete their orientation and probationary period up on the medical surgical unit. And their reasoning behind this was supposedly because it was a slower pace, and because the most experienced charge nurses were on the medical surgical unit. Personally, I think this was a staffing issue because nobody wanted to work there. So I figured if I had to wait out my probationary period on med-surg, I would just start on the night shift, right? It's gotta be a slower pace and not much really happens on the night shift, right? And honestly, I was just ready to get to work. I was so excited that I finally finished my degree and now had a chance to start making some money and stop living paycheck to paycheck. And the hospital offered a really good night shift differential and bonus to work on certain units like med-surg, so I really could never figure out why no one wanted to work there. So when I finally was able to start, I basically just spent the first few nights following the charge nurse around, and then eventually on the third night, they pretty much just threw me out to the wolves on my own with my own patient load. And I was kind of pissed because I knew I was supposed to have a one-on-one orientation with this charge nurse for at least a week before I started taking patients on my own. But once again, somebody stopped showing up to work and they got fired. So they were short-staffed and I got booted from the nest and had to learn how to fly on my own, as a charge nurse said. So this was like, the third or fourth night on my own ever as a nurse, and I'm so nervous and anxious, I'm just trying to fumble my way through the night and really try not to kill anybody. But don't worry, the charge nurse told me just to holler if I needed anything. What I needed was orientation, but whatever. I was doing my rounds at about 2 a.m. and I went to go check on my patient in room 305. I had been feeling anxious and nervous all night, in addition to this place just being creepy at night. This medical surgical unit at night, when the lights were dimmed, it just gave off a really creepy vibe. And really, when I say everything felt a little off, I mean it. Even like the place smelled different at night. I don't even know how to explain it, but it was, all in all, I was really anxious, I was really nervous, and I tried to chalk it all up to just being tired and stressed and ultimately a little pissed off. So as I'm outside room 305, like looking through my notes, trying to make sure this is even the right person, I hear this very faint, rhythmic beeping. Beep, beep, beep. And it was the heart rate monitor coming from the room next door. It took me a little bit to figure out what it was because we're not supposed to hear them at night. They're basically muted in the middle of the night. And they're muted for a couple different reasons. Number one, because they're super annoying and no one can sleep through them. And number two, because they're monitored at the nurse's station. Even if they're muted in the patient's room, the charge nurse at the nurse's station can still see each monitor. So if something were to go wrong, somebody can see it. And the room next door, 307, was not my patient. I had enough on my plate to try to keep track of. I couldn't worry about somebody else's patient too. And as selfish as this sounds, I was kind of like, well, I'm gonna let the other nurse worry about it. Either she's gonna hear it and come down and silence it, or the patient in 307 is going to get pissed off and put their light on and tell them to shut it off. Either way, it wasn't something I was ready to deal with at that point. As I was finishing up with my patient, he was like, yeah, I'm so sorry. I hate to be that guy, but that beeping is really starting to annoy me. I just want to go back to sleep. Could you please do something about it? Fine. So I made sure my guy in 305 was good, and as I was leaving, I turned to the left to room 307, which at this point it was pretty clear that 307 was where the monitor was, and that's where the beeping was coming from. So I did a faint little knock, introduced myself, pushed the door open a little bit, fully expecting for this patient to be wide awake and ready for someone to deal with this monitor. But I didn't hear anything other than that constant rhythmic beeping. Because there was no response, I pushed the door open just a little bit further, just enough so the light could go in so I could see into the room. And the room was pitch black, except I could see the glow from the monitor across the room. And this room was super dark, and I wasn't about to turn any lights on. The patient was obviously sleeping. I have no idea who this person is. I don't know why they're there, and I also don't know how crabby they are. So I opened the door just wide enough to scooch myself through so I can start very quietly sneaking my way over to the monitor. And my eyes hadn't adjusted yet, but all the hospital rooms are basically laid out the same, so I had a pretty good idea where everything was. Except the tray table. And if you've ever bumped into one of those flimsy excuses of a table, you know they are the loudest thing in that entire room. So I only set my focus on getting to that monitor and not ramming into the tray table that was lurking about somewhere in the room. So I finally, after inching through this room, trying not to hit anything, make my way over to the monitor, which probably only took me a minute or so, but it felt like forever. And once I got over to the monitor, I knew exactly what to do. Even though I was new as a nurse, I had muted these things 1,000 times in the ER as a nurse's aide, so I knew exactly where the button was and I knew exactly what to do. So I pushed the button and I turned around to leave, and I remember thinking to myself, man, this guy or gal must be a solid sleeper because their heart rhythm hasn't went up, their pulse hasn't went up, their blood pressure hasn't went up, and I know that if I were asleep in the hospital in the middle of the night and I woke up and saw some strange person creeping through my room, my monitor would be alarming. But apparently this person slept through the whole thing, which I was very grateful for. So as I turned back to face the partially open door, at this point my eyes have adjusted pretty well. I've spotted the tray table, I know exactly where it is, and I make my way to the door. I'm just ready to be done. As I'm making my way around the bed to try to leave, I all of a sudden got this full body chill, and I can't even explain it. It's like I all of a sudden felt vulnerable and scared and like I was being watched. I was just terrified. It was like there was some kind of threat that just came on all of a sudden, and I was in a full-blown panic. I was panicking, and I could feel with every fiber of my being that that patient was no longer sleeping. They were awake, and I could feel in my bones they were pissed off, and it was terrifying. So now that my eyes have fully adjusted, I whip my head around quick to look at the patient in the bed. But as I'm standing there, staring at the bed, I was just dumped. There's nobody in it. There was nobody in that bed. As I'm staring at the bed, just trying to process what is happening at this moment, I look over at the monitor and I can see it's alarming. All the alarms are going off. The red lights are flashing. The pulse is through the roof. The blood pressure has skyrocketed. And of course, I didn't hear when it happened because I had just muted it. So I finally unstuck myself from where I was pretty sure my feet were actually glued to the tile in that room, and I made a beeline and started sprinting for the light switch. And just as my fingers reached the plastic of the light switch, I felt this cold hand grab my wrist and yank it away. And it was done with force, like whoever it was did not want that light on. So I pulled my hand back, and I think the momentum from me sprinting and then me pulling my hand back kind of launched me out the door and into the charge nurse. And she was like, "What the heck is going on here? The monitor in 307 is going crazy." And I was like, "Yeah, I fucking know. I went to go mute it because it was annoying my patient in 305. But after I got in there and muted it, I realized the patient wasn't in the bed, and I panicked." And the charge nurse was like, "What the hell are you talking about? There's nobody in 307. We don't have a patient in that room." She was confused. I was confused. So I ended up just telling her the story of what happened. I was checking on my patient in 305. He was irritated by the monitor, so I told him I would go in and mute it, because apparently nobody else was coming to mute it. And then I told her how I went in there, I muted the monitor, and I looked over and there was no patient in the bed, and I panicked. I felt like somebody was watching me while I was in there. It really scared me, so I just needed to get out. I did not tell her about the hand grabbing my wrist and yanking it away from the light switch. Listen, I already felt crazy enough telling my charge nurse on my third or fourth day as a nurse about how I just panicked in a room because there wasn't anybody in there. I really didn't want to make it worse. It was already a pretty crazy story. I was stressed out and I was tired. And really everything but the actual physical touch part, I tried to justify it in my head as I was just stressed out. But at this point, I felt really dumb after retelling the story and hearing it out loud. And I thought, God, this is crazy. There's no way she's gonna believe me. But honestly, she wasn't really shocked or surprised at all. And she was kind of like, yeah, that monitor in 307 goes off on its own all the time with no one hooked up to it. She said at least once a week during the middle of the night, that monitor will pop up on the screen active like someone's using it when they're not. And they have no explanation for it. She was very reassuring and very comforting, but it was very obvious that she did not want to talk about this anymore. It was almost like she was over it, like she had had this conversation a million times already. So I finished up my probationary period on med-surg, but I switched to the day shift as soon as I could. And I did make a mental note for the rest of my time there that 307 was hardly ever occupied. And when they did put somebody in that room, it was for a very short amount of time. The minute another room was open, they moved that patient. And even though they offered me $1.50 more an hour on top of the night shift differential to stay on med-surg, I transferred back to the ER as soon as I could. And honestly, I just never really talked about it again after that point, because I didn't want to. Before this, we used to have so much fun trying to scare each other and swapping ghost stories in the ER. But after this, I really just wanted to forget what happened. Camping here was a huge mistake. I thought a weekend away on a remote camping trip would be exactly what I needed to rebuild my confidence and move on with my life. But after what happened last summer, I would rather be living that old miserable life. I was living in Minneapolis when I had just gotten a phone call from my brother Mike. He had just started dating this new girl Jen, and he really liked her. And he wanted to find some different ways to spend more time with her and really try to impress her. I guess she was a really outdoorsy person, so Mike wanted to take her camping. I don't know, maybe just to show off his survival skills or something. But he was calling to ask if I wanted to join them for the weekend. Which was a really odd thing to ask because camping is not really my thing. In fact, nature in general is really not my thing. Between the two of us growing up, Mike had always been the more brave, bold, and adventurous one. And me, well, I was kind of the nerdy, introverted kid that doesn't like bugs and whose skin just burns the instant it sees sun. So needless to say, I was not built for the outdoors. But I think Mike had started to sense that I was getting depressed. I had just gotten laid off from my job. And even though I got a severance package, that wasn't gonna last forever. And I was applying for more jobs, but I wasn't even getting callbacks at this point. And between the bills piling up and the stress of just not knowing what's gonna happen next, I really started to withdraw. And I stopped hanging out with family and friends and really just stayed in my home with my dog Bear. I felt worthless, like I couldn't do anything right, and I was feeling so useless. I couldn't even get a call back for these jobs that I was more than qualified for. So I don't know, I guess I said yes to this whole weekend camping and nature thing to try something new, something that I didn't think I was good at. And maybe that would help get me out from under this depression and give me some confidence back. And with Mike and Jen there, I might actually learn a new skill. I mean, if there's a zombie apocalypse, I should probably know how to start a fire at least, right? So when Friday rolled around, we all actually got off work a little bit early so that we could get a jump start on this many-hour drive we had ahead of us. Plus, it was a beautiful summer day. The sun was shining, there was a little breeze, it was just perfect. It was just what I felt like I needed, and the forecast said the whole weekend was going to be like this, so I was pretty pumped. So we all crammed into Mike's little Toyota Camry, which was stuffed to the brim with all of our camping gear and clothes and food, and of course, beer, because we're going camping. And I was probably going to need something to help me sleep and to help with my anxiety of being out in the woods. We were heading north up to this little state park that was about 3 hours away. I guess Mike had come across it while he was doing some research to try to find campsites for primitive camping, which FYI was something he left out of our original conversation. So I quick pull out my phone to Google what primitive camping was, and if we hadn't already been in the car, I would have said no. But it was too late now. We were heading out into the middle of nowhere of the woods of northern Minnesota. Mike was driving and Jen was riding shotgun, and I was in the back with Bear. And I had adopted Bear a few years ago when I came across his picture on the shelter website, and his cute little, I just couldn't say no. I fell in love with him instantly. And everyone always asks me what kind of dog he is, and I'm like, I don't know. He's a 30-pound mixed breed. He kind of looks like a beagle, so he's probably got some kind of beagle mix in him. And Bear is the best dog, but a lot like me, he wasn't built for the outdoors, at least not that I'm aware of. I mean, I had never taken him on anything more extreme than a walk through the city park. And to try to keep him safe, I kind of put this little bell on his collar. I don't know, I guess my thought process is that if he takes off running into the woods, we'd be able to hear him. I don't know, in my mind it made sense. We were about an hour into this drive up to the state park, and Bear and I were in the back seat playing tug with an old ski cap that Mike had in the back seat of the Camry, when I heard him and Jen kind of having a heated conversation in the front seat. So naturally, I leaned in a little closer to get the tea, and from what I could gather, it sounds like Mike didn't actually reserve a camping spot at this park. And I didn't even know you had to reserve camping spots. But Mike said when he looked up the park on the DNR website, it said it had 10 primitive camping spots, but there was no way to actually reserve it on the site. And also, if you are dumb like me when it comes to outdoor stuff, primitive camping means there's nothing. It's just dirt. There's no electricity, there's no water, there's no toilets, nothing. Who does this? And Jen was getting kind of heated because she's like, I've reserved tons of camping sites on the DNR website. There's always a way to reserve them. You have to reserve them. It's one DNR website. It's all the same. And as Jen was getting a little bit more heated, Mike jumped in and told us, because at this point they figured out I was eavesdropping, he said that he actually called ahead to the park and nobody answered, but he did leave a voicemail saying that when we were going to be there and that we wanted to reserve spot number 10. It was far enough away from the ranger station, so if there were other campers, this spot probably wouldn't be the first one picked. And he did say that we would pay when we got there. He was also pretty excited about this spot because he said, my God, if it was this much of a pain in the ass to reserve a spot, there probably wasn't going to be a whole lot of other people there. But either way, we were hours into it at this point, and there wasn't really any turning back. It seemed like the longer that we were in the car, though, driving, the trees got denser and denser, and the canopy got so thick that it just got darker and darker the further we drove into this. And the road kept getting smaller and crappier, like at some point the state just stopped maintaining it altogether. Eventually, Mike pulled the car over to the side of the road to try to find where the turnoff was to get into the state park. And it was the perfect timing because I was just starting to feel so car sick from all the bouncing around from this unmaintained road. Now, at this point, there was no cell service out here, which Mike must have known. He had downloaded the directions prior to that day, so he was looking for where the turnoff was to enter the state park. And as Mike was looking at the maps, I just remember thinking, man, it is really dark. It's 3 p.m., but it is so dark here right now. And it was because of the trees and the canopy. Whatever sunlight was out was barely getting through that canopy. So it looked like it was way later in the day than it actually was. So Mike finally figured out where this little road was to get into the park. And you guys, when I tell you this is something straight out of a horror movie. It was this tiny little like 2-rut road, and the road is being generous. I was sure the Toyota was gonna lose something from under it, as like you could feel the bottom just scraping against dirt and rocks. And then when we finally got to the ranger station, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. This thing looks like it's been abandoned for 100 years and there's nobody here. And Mike, the ever supportive little brother that he was, reassured me that of course I was just being a little bitch, and it was Friday afternoon, so they were gone for the day. So we decided we were just gonna make our way on to spot number 10. If the rangers showed up, they showed up. We'd pay them then. Otherwise, we'll pay them tomorrow when they get here. So in order to even get to spot number 10, you have to pull the car over onto this little clearing and then unload all of your stuff. And then you have to walk on this tiny little claustrophobic trail for about 10 or 15 yards until you come out into the open area for the campsite. And this campsite was nothing like I had expected. I mean, I know that I'm not the most experienced camper, but I was really expecting something like you see in the movies. First off, I was expecting to see other campers at this campsite, and we didn't see any in any of the spots on the way to number 10. And I was expecting to have, that dramatic moment where you get out of the car, stand hands on hips, take a deep breath of the fresh air, and just feel relaxed. But that's not what we got. It was just dark. And even though it was a bright sunny day, you would never know. And it almost felt like the air was like thick and stagnant or like stale. Like there was no airflow. I'm not quite sure how to explain it, but it didn't feel good. It certainly didn't feel relaxing at all. And I could tell by the expression on Jen's face that this is not what she was expecting at all either. But hers was different. Mine was more of just being annoyed and inconvenienced by Mother Nature. She actually seemed a little concerned. I had no idea why. And Mike, if he was expecting something different, he certainly wasn't going to tell us. Because according to him, this was the best campsite in the entire world. And we were so lucky to have it all to ourselves. Oh my God, if we had only known how unlucky we actually were, we should have turned around right then and left. But Mike, he was bound and determined to make sure that we had a great time. So we unpacked the Camry, got the tent set up, and Jen actually taught me how to make a fire, which was pretty cool. And by this time it was around 7 p.m. and we were all sitting around the campfire. And that's when Jen finally spoke up about what was bothering her about the site. She just kind of looked around and said, "There's no noise." And I was like, well, yeah, isn't that the whole point? And then she just looks at me with this look of like a mix of annoyance and pity, because I think she was really starting to understand how much I did not belong here. And she said, "No, you don't understand. We are in the middle of the woods on a beautiful summer evening, and there is no noise, no wind, no branches swaying, no leaves rustling, no critters running around, and no birds." And then Mike spoke up with this tone that I hadn't heard before. It was kind of a concern, but not concern. It's just weird. But he had said too, yeah, when we were driving in, I was watching both sides of the road to make sure nothing ran out in front of us, and I didn't see anything. He says I didn't see any animals. And I guess I didn't really understand why that was a big deal at that point. And I was just about to ask, but before I could even get the words out of my mouth, Bear just pops up, starts barking, and bolts into the woods. It happened so fast, I didn't even know what to do. I just got up and started running. That's when Mike just grabbed my arm and goes, nope. He said, these woods are so dense and so thick, you can't go running into them by yourself. You'll get turned around and lost. And it would be so hard to find you. But I didn't want to wait for Mike. I wanted to go find Bear before he gets eaten by like an actual bear. But Mike said no, and he really quick got in his bag. He grabbed a roll of reflective tape and a compass. And then the three of us started walking into the woods, single file. So Mike in the front, me in the middle, and Jen in the back. And about every third or fourth tree, Mike was marking it with this reflective tape and then looking at the compass. And don't ask me what he was doing. I have no idea what he was doing. And we were walking for about 30 minutes in this dark-ass forest, in this single file line. And we were calling to Bear. And then finally we could hear him barking. We could hear his little bell ringing. Who would have known? It actually worked. We couldn't see him, but we could hear the direction that it was coming from. And it didn't take us long to find him. He actually wasn't that far away. We just could not see him through these trees. As we were walking towards him, towards the sound of the barking, we kind of just popped out of these dense trees into this small little clearing. I don't know units of measurement. It was like the size of my front yard. I live in the middle of the city. It was not big. And I saw Bear right away. He was standing in the middle of this clearing, barking at something that looked like a tree stump, something sticking out of the ground. And I'm calling for him, like whistling, Bear, come on, come here, come over. And he's not even hearing me. He is laser focused on whatever this thing was that he found so interesting. So I start walking over towards him, and as I get closer, I can see it's not a tree stump that he's barking at. It's like a headstone for a grave. And it looked like it had been out here for a long time. It was covered in like dirt and moss and like nature-ish things, I guess. And I tried to look closer at it to see if I could find some kind of name or a date or something on it to identify who this was. But as I looked close, there was no carvings on it. And at least if there was at one point, there wasn't anymore. So I was kind of brushing the surface of it to see if I could find something. And as I brushed a piece of moss away, this black beetle comes crawling out, and nope, I'm done. I don't want to see this anymore. So I grabbed Bear's collar, I slapped the leash on him, and I'm like, all right, buddy, let's get out of here. But at that moment, I got this really strange feeling that came over me, and I don't really know. It was this mix of like anxiety and nervousness. But I just shook it off, and I looked around for Mike and Jen, and I could see they were on the other side of this clearing, looking at more headstones, and kind of as I looked, like, it's a cemetery. There's headstones everywhere. We stumbled into a super old cemetery. It was kind of cool. And these headstones were just beautiful. Some of them had these beautifully intricate designs just carved into the stone. But none of them had names, or at least not anything that you could still see. I mean, it probably wore off over time. And some of them even had these like little stone flowers that had been carved and just kind of placed on the ground in front of the headstone in the grass. And I had never seen anything like this before, so I grabbed my phone and I started taking pictures. This was really cool. And I guess I was hoping to kind of try to find something on the internet when I Googled it, just to give me a little bit more history of this place. Like, where did it come from? Who are they? And we didn't stay long. We only stayed about 20 minutes or so. But as we were getting ready to leave, Mike makes a really weird comment that just changes the vibe from cool and fun to somewhat creepy. There was no way to get into this cemetery. He pointed out there's no trails. There's no road. There's no way to get to this cemetery. The only reason we got there was because we stumbled through the woods. But why would there be a cemetery here in the middle of the forest, in the middle of nowhere, with no way to get to it? And it's in a state park. I don't know, it's just, the whole thing seemed really weird. And really with that realization, we were all funned out and it was time to go back. It was already getting late. It was after 8 and we did not want to be stuck out here at night. It was already dark. I can't imagine how dark this place is at night. And we got back in our single file line with me in the middle, and as we were leaving, that anxious, nervous feeling really started to kind of turn into almost paranoia. Like I felt like we were being watched, like we had done something wrong. So we managed to successfully navigate our way back to spot number 10. And by this time it was really, really dark. And we were just sitting around the campfire, kind of trying to like just decompress from the evening. The three of us just kind of sat there in silence for a while, just listening to the crackling of the fire and just almost mesmerized, just staring into it. And that's when Jen kind of spoke up again and said, I still didn't see any animals. Even when we were walking in the middle of the woods, I still didn't even see a trace of an animal. And I kind of piped up, well, there had to be something. I mean, Bear literally chased something out into the woods. If it wasn't an animal, then what was it? And as soon as the words left my mouth, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it, but I had no idea what it was. She was right though. We had been there for hours at that point, and there was zero signs of life other than us. And as I'm kind of sitting there like lost in my own thoughts, I kind of come back to as Mike pipes up and says to Jen, "Don't worry, babe, I got you something for protection." And then he reaches in his pocket and pulls out one of those stone flowers from the cemetery. He must have grabbed it at some point before we left, but I didn't see him take it. I watch enough TV and movies to know I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to take that stuff, but I wasn't going to bring it up. I was so exhausted. I just wanted to go to bed. And Mike and Jen were tired too, so Mike puts out the fire and they get into their tent and Bear and I get into our tent and we fall asleep pretty quickly. But between Bear kind of chasing stuff in his sleep, like moving his legs, and then the eerie silence, like it was so quiet that it was uncomfortable. Like it was hard to sleep in. So at some point during the middle of the night, I'm laying there listening to Bear chase whatever it is in his sleep, and I can hear this faint sound like rustling in the leaves, just on the edge of the campsite. So it's not close to us, but it's out in the woods a little bit. So it was like an animal moving around in the woods. And it was getting louder, like it was coming closer to the campsite, which I'm just trying to justify in my mind as, hey, animals are curious, right? They're just going to come in, see what's happening. It's not a big deal. Relax. You'll be fine. As the rustling got closer, it kind of turned into these like footsteps type of sound, but it wasn't how like an animal would sound. So it wasn't these erratic little bouncing around footsteps. It was very rhythmic, like a human walking. And it started to just like circle our campsite, just continuously, slowly circling. I was pretty freaked out, I'm not gonna lie, starting to panic a lot. But I did calm down a little bit when I realized it's probably the park ranger, right? Like he's probably wondering, who the hell is this? They didn't have a reservation. These just some random people here in spot number 10. And he's probably looking around to make sure we're not dangerous or doing something stupid. But this went on for like a agonizingly long time, like, and without this person saying anything. If this was the ranger, why wouldn't they have said something at this point? And whoever it was caught the attention of Bear, because Bear pops up and starts growling. And I'm kind of reaching down, trying to frantically get him to be quiet. Bear, stop. And then when I listen again, the footsteps have stopped. But now all I could hear was this just heavy breathing. And this was not normal breathing. Like this was like wet and rattly and loud. And this was unnatural. It felt very unnatural. This did not feel human at all to me. And I didn't know what to do. I was trying to keep Bear calm, but having this like psycho or whatever this was standing out there like creepy murder breathing while I'm trying to figure out, I'm panicking at this point. I can't think straight. And Bear must have noticed that I was panicking, because then he started to get all riled up and he started barking. And just as I reached down to try shutting him up, I hear whatever this thing is start running full speed at my tent. It was so fast, I really didn't have time to process what was happening. This thing was running at me full speed and it was not going to stop. It was going to run right through my tent. So I just grabbed Bear and we're just like bracing for impact. And it's running closer, and then just as it's like nothing happened. But there was no way that it could have stopped. Where did it go? There was no way that it could have stopped. It was going too fast. But in my panic state, I didn't know. I must have been yelling, and Bear was barking, and all of a sudden you could hear Mike start yelling, "What the hell is going on out there?" So I just quick unzipped my tent and I bolted out there, and I couldn't see anything. It was so dark. The only thing I could see was Mike's flashlight. And Mike quickly got the fire going again so that we had at least some light out there. And somehow having the campfire going, it was able to calm me down enough to start trying to tell Mike and Jen what was happening. So as I'm telling them what I heard and what happened, Mike grabs his flashlight and he starts going and looking around my tent and looking around the backside of it and over by the trees. And he was just like, holy shit, there's footprints everywhere. So both Jen and I, we went over there to see what he was talking about. He wasn't kidding. There was footprints everywhere in the circle all around the campsite. And then the ones that were running right up to my tent, and it literally stopped right at the edge of my tent. But there were no tracks going any other way. There was nowhere for this thing to have gone. Where did it go? But I'm not even kidding you. That wasn't even the creepiest part. The creepiest part was whoever made these or whatever made these footprints, they were barefoot. There were no shoes. These were barefoot human prints. And as we're just standing there, just dumbfounded, what is going on? Out of the eerie silence comes this very faint whistling or singing. I'm not even quite sure what it was. It was very faint, and it felt like it was coming from everywhere. We were all terrified. It was like 3 o'clock in the morning and we had no idea what to do. It was so dark. We couldn't see anything, and not one of us wanted to try to pack up our stuff and try to find that tiny little trail out to the car. We didn't want to be anywhere away from this campfire, from like the comfort of the light of this campfire. And I made sure I had Bear on the leash next to me so that at least if anything was trying to creep up on us, he could alert us that they were coming. And throughout all of this whistling was still going on. And we all just stood there by the fire together trying to figure out what to do. And it was around that time when Bear started to growl. And this was like a deep, low, guttural growl. Like, I had never heard Bear make this noise before, but it was clear. There was no doubt in my mind that this was him very clearly letting whatever it was know that he was upset and to not come anywhere near us. And he's just staring out into the woods, just laser focused. His head was moving. You were watching him just kind of track whatever this was moving around out in the woods. And he was laser focused on it. And it must have been moving just outside the reach of the light of the fire. My heart was beating so fast, I thought I was gonna pass out. And then Jen screams out that she could see something moving through the trees, and it was huge. So Mike quickly takes his flashlight and shines it in the direction that Jen said it was. And I don't know what we saw. I don't know what we were looking at. It definitely was not an animal, but it wasn't a human, and it didn't move. It was just standing there staring at us. It was just watching us. And like, it was tall. It was like 8 to 10 feet tall. And it was human shaped, but it wasn't human. And it's like arms and fingers were like abnormally and like grotesquely long. And it was so thin that you could see the bones like protruding through its skin, like it was wasting away. And like it looked like it had a human face, but it wasn't proportioned right. Like the lower jaw was like sticking out past its face, and its eyes were like jet black, and they stood out in contrast to this like grayish pale skin. Like, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There's no way this could be real. There's no way this could really be happening. And this whole time, from the minute we stepped foot out of that car until now, the woods have been eerie silent. But at that moment, it was like the whole forest woke up, and there was just noise coming from everywhere. There was branches snapping on one side of us, and this thing was running through the woods on the other side of us, and the whistling and what now is sounding like voices, like conversations happening all around us all at one time. I felt so overwhelmed. Like I was panicked. Like I couldn't breathe. I couldn't remember how to breathe. And then, just like that, silence. It stopped. It went silent again. And the only thing that any one of us could say was Mike started, he was able to stutter, "What the hell is going on?" But other than that, no one said anything. We didn't know what to say. We didn't know what to do. We just stood there huddled together by the fire for what seemed like hours, just waiting. I don't know what we were waiting for. We were just waiting for, was this thing going to come back? Was there more that was going to happen? Was something else crazy going to happen? We were just waiting in silence. And then finally we heard another noise coming from the trees, coming from out in the woods, and it was so faint at first, and then it just kept getting louder and louder, and it was a bell. But it wasn't any bell, it was Bear's bell, the bell from his collar. And the panic just came flooding back in, but it wasn't panic for my own safety, it was panic for Bear. That thing had my dog, and I was just about ready to take off into the woods running after it. I didn't care about anything else. I needed to get out there and save Bear. But as I started forward, I felt the leash. I felt the leash in my hand. I still had it. Bear was still here. He was still attached to the leash. I had a death grip on this thing for so long, I guess I didn't even feel it in my hand still. Oh my God, I was so relieved. He was here. He wasn't in any danger. Bear was right here. But I heard it. I heard the bell, and I heard him yelp out in the forest. I know my dog's voice. That was Bear. That was him. Was this thing trying to lure me out into the woods? Was it trying to get me to run out there by myself to save my dog? Because that's what would have happened. I wouldn't have waited for anybody else. I was ready to take off and save Bear. I almost took off and ran right into the dense trees, into the backyard of whatever this thing was that was stalking us. After that, we all agreed we are staying right here, planted, huddled together by this fire until it gets light enough that we can see something and get the hell out of here. And the next couple hours waiting for the sun to come up it was exhausting. After all of that chaos, everything went back to this eerie silence, which didn't make it any better. We were constantly looking, we were constantly scanning the tree line to see if we could see anything, constantly wondering if this thing was gonna show itself again. We couldn't see it, but we could all feel it. We could all feel it out there watching us from just outside the tree line. And finally, around 6 a.m., it started to get light again. The sun started to come up, and whatever little bits of it that could peek through that canopy started to come through. And then we heard the sounds of this truck, like slowly coming up this 2-rut road, making its way up the path to our site. It had to be the ranger. He must have been back on duty for the day, finally. When we eventually saw the headlights, all three of us just started yelling, just screaming for help. Help us. Oh my God, we're saved. After we told the ranger what had happened, he wasn't as dismissive as I thought he was going to be, but he definitely did not believe us. Or at least that's what I gathered, because he really wasn't saying a whole lot. He was just kind of like staring at us, which I don't really blame him. I'm sure this sounds really ridiculous, but like, why would we make this up? Why would we make this story up? But what was interesting though is when we got to the part of the story where we were telling the ranger about finding the cemetery, that's when he really perked up. He didn't say anything, but you could tell from his body language that he was interested in this part. But ultimately, when we were done retelling the story to him, he just kind of blew it off and started getting very accusatory at that point. Well, I see beer. Were you guys out here drinking? Were you high on something? Like, what's going on? And I've been a ranger in this park for 30 years. If there was a cemetery out here, I'd know about it. And ultimately, what it boiled down to is he didn't believe us. And I don't know that I would have believed us either. And I didn't care. Like, honestly, I wanted to get out of there. So the ranger stood there with us and watched us pack up our campsite, make sure we take everything, and then haul it through the little trail and shove it into the Camry. We were just getting ready to take off from this nightmare when I realized I left my phone. I set it down on a stone by the campfire when I was trying to wrestle my tent back into its bag. The ranger is still over there. I told Mike and Jen I will be right back, and I took off trotting through the trail. And just about when I was at the end of this trail, so the part that opens up into the camping area, I look over and I can see the ranger standing at the far end of the campsite with like his flashlight up, just kind of like scanning the tree line. He was looking for something, and it wasn't until I walked into the campsite that the ranger put his flashlight down and whipped around and stared at me. And I could see in his one hand was the flashlight, but in the other hand, he had his gun drawn. And he just kind of starts slowly walking over to me, just staring at me, not breaking his gaze at all. So I quickly reached down and grabbed my phone. I'm like, hey man, I left my phone. But this guy, he didn't stop. He walked until he got right up in my face. And I have no idea what possessed me to say it. But before I could stop myself, I asked him, did you see it? And he looks me dead in the eyes and he says in the most terrifyingly calm, steady, and authoritative voice, do not come back here again. It will be waiting for you. Look, I know how this is gonna sound, but I need you to hear me out, okay? I bought a haunted painting and nobody believes me. I've always been drawn to really weird and really macabre art. You know the kind I'm talking about. The kind that makes people uncomfortable when they walk past it, but yet you can't stop looking at it. That kind. I love it. And I love going to antique shops and garage sales and scrolling through Facebook Marketplace, just to try to find that new weird little piece that I can add to my collection. So about a month ago, I was scrolling through Facebook Marketplace and I saw a posting for an estate sale in the older part of the city. So there's got to be good stuff there. Man, I really wish I had never seen that post. It was a fairly large mansion. And one of those ones that is original to the city because it's way too big and there's way too much property. You would never be able to buy anything that large with that much area in the city anymore unless you were super ultra wealthy. Anyway, they had what seemed like everything that was inside this massive old mansion spread out in the front lawn, almost looking like a hoity-toity outdoor flea market. So I got to work digging through all this old junk. Racks of clothes, old Christmas stuff, old furniture that had seen better days. The usual estate sale mess. And that's when I spotted it. The painting, it was propped up against this old wooden chair back in the corner, and it was partially hidden by boxes full of old Christmas decorations. And it wasn't all that big, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. It had this simple wooden frame around it that had seen better days, but man, there was something about it. It just grabbed me, you know? It was an oil painting of a fancy Victorian era dining room. It had a long table that dominated the entire scene, and the table was set for dinner. It had fine china and crystal glasses that all caught the light from some unseen window. It was really detailed stuff, like you could reach out and touch the crystal glasses on the table. But here's the thing that made it interesting. There were no people in the painting. All the chairs were pushed back from the table, like everyone had just gotten up and left in the middle of eating, or like they all just vanished mid-bite. There was half-eaten food on the plates, and one glass was tipped over with the red wine spilling out of it. Pretty cool, right? The longer I looked, the more details I noticed. There was a door that stood slightly open in the background, but it was really open to nothing. It was just a jet black room. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be. And there was something about the perspective that just felt wrong. Like the room was slightly tilted, but only when you weren't looking at it directly. It was really weird. The old lady that was running the sale, man, she was so creepy. She scared the crap out of me. She snuck up behind me out of nowhere while I was looking at this painting. She told me that the painting had belonged to her aunt, who purchased it without ever seeing it, and then flew over to Europe to pick it up and bring it back for her collection. $30, she said. I hesitated. Wait, what? I was so confused. $30 for an oil painting that your aunt bought without ever seeing it, didn't have it shipped, but flew to Europe to bring it back. $30, she said, and practically pushed the painting at me. That probably should have been my first red flag. That and the fact that her hands were shaking as I gave her the cash. But I was too excited about this. I had just got this amazingly creepy painting with an awesome backstory for only $30. So I took it home and hung it up in my living room right away. I was so pumped. My roommate, Rachel, on the other hand, she was significantly less enthusiastic about it than I was, which I somewhat expected because she typically always hates it when I put up creepy stuff in our apartment in the common areas. She said it gave her the creeps and that she felt like she was being watched, which pissed me off a little bit because there wasn't even any people in the painting. If you don't like it, just say you don't like it. I just kind of laughed it off. That's what makes it interesting, right? It gives the place a creepy vibe. She just rolled her eyes and again just reminded me that it gave her the creeps. And that was the last normal conversation we had about that painting. That night, everything changed. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of glassware clanking together. And at first I thought Rachel was having a late night snack, but when I went to tell her to keep it down, there was no one there. The sound had stopped, so I figured I was just imagining it and I went back to bed. But as I passed by the painting, I noticed something was off. One of the chairs was pushed closer to the table. But how is that possible? I turned on the main light and just stared at it. And I mean, you guys, I studied this painting. When I was at that estate sale, I stared at this painting for an hour. I memorized every detail of it. And I was positive that chair had moved. But it was late, I was tired, I told myself I was being ridiculous, and it was just the shadows, right? They were just playing tricks on me. So I went back to sleep. And I slept like shit because I couldn't stop thinking about it. But I remembered that I had taken a picture of it to post on Instagram right after I hung it on the wall. So I did feel some sense of relief because at least I could settle this in the morning. So the next morning, I pulled out my phone to compare the photo to the painting, and I felt my stomach drop. That freaking chair had definitely moved. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to notice. But when I showed it to Rachel, she didn't see it. She looked at the photo on my phone and looked at the painting and said they looked exactly the same. Like, what are you talking about? The chair is clearly not in the same spot. I didn't know what else to do, so I kind of just laughed it off and was like, yeah, you're probably right. I'm probably just crazy. But I'm positive that chair was not in the same place. And you guys, the next morning, I shit you not, that chair had moved again. It had moved closer to the table. I know what I was seeing and no one believed me. I became obsessed. I started documenting the changes every day. The chairs, all of them, started moving closer to the table. The spilled wine, it began to right itself, and the food on the plates gradually started to disappear bite by bite. But I was the only one who could see it. Rachel, her boyfriend Mike, all of our friends, they all said it looked the same to them. It looked the exact same as the day I brought it home. Like, this is nuts. I don't know what's happening. Am I actually starting to go crazy, for God's sakes? And that's when the shadows started to move. I noticed it first in the doorway at the back of the painting. The darkness there seemed to pulse like it was breathing. Sometimes, late at night, I would stare at the painting and I swear I could see something shifting in those shadows. Vague humanoid shapes that would retreat when I looked directly at them. And the dreams, they started a week later. In the dreams, I was sitting at the table, but from a different angle than the painting showed. The food in front of me smelled delicious, but it writhed and moved on my plate when I tried to eat it. And there were other people at the table, but I could never quite see their faces. They spoke in a whispered gibberish that made my skin crawl. and I always woke up the next morning with the taste of red wine in my mouth. Rachel started avoiding the living room altogether. She said she would get headaches when she was in there, but she was still insistent that it had nothing to do with the painting and that the painting still looked the same. And Mike, her boyfriend, he stopped coming over altogether, started making up excuses about having to work late. And late one night, a couple months after I brought the painting home, I was up in my room working on my laptop when I heard that familiar clanking of glassware. I knew Rachel wasn't home and I was the only one there. My stomach was in knots. I knew where it was coming from. So I made my way to the living room, and as soon as I entered, the sound stopped again, like usual. But this time when I looked up, the painting had changed dramatically. All the chairs were pushed in, and that wine glass was upright and full, and the plates were all full of fresh food, and there were people at the table. They were painted in the same detailed style as the rest of the scene. Victorian-era men and women in their finest dinner clothes. Their faces were all turned away from the viewer and focused on their meals. But as I watched, I was horrified when one of them slowly began to turn towards me. I ran to my room and locked the door, and then I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blankets like a child. And I sat there all night, listening to the sounds of a dinner party happening in my living room. Quiet conversations, gentle laughter, and even the clinking of glassware. What the hell is happening? The next morning, the painting was back to its original state. Empty chairs, spilled wine, and half-eaten food. I didn't know what else to do, so I tried to take it down, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the frame was fused to the wall somehow. Rachel thought I was having some kind of breakdown, so she started staying at Mike's place until I started seeing a therapist. I needed to get rid of this thing, but I didn't know what to do. No one would help me because no one believed me. They all thought I was crazy. I even went back to the house where I bought the damn thing to try to get some answers. But when I got there, the house was all boarded up. Windows were broken. It looked abandoned, and it looked like it had been abandoned for years. I was at my wit's end. I tried everything I could think of to destroy the painting. Fire wouldn't touch it, water beads right off of it, and I even took a hammer to it once, but the hammer just bounced off the canvas. It didn't even chip the paint. Rachel came home one day and found me sitting on the floor sobbing, surrounded by lighter fluid and matches. That's when she called my parents. They're coming tomorrow to help me move home for a while. They think I'm having some kind of mental health crisis. Maybe I am, but I know what I'm seeing. But the most terrifying thing happened in my last dream. I finally saw the faces of the people at the dinner table. They were all the same face, the old woman from the estate sale, but much younger. And none of them were eating the food. Arranged with precision on each of their plates was a photograph, recent photographs, of me, of Rachel, of Mike, of every one of my family and friends that had looked at that painting. And now there's an empty chair at the table that wasn't there before. It wasn't in the original painting, but it's there now. And it's pulled back from the table, waiting for someone to sit down. I think it's for me. I thought that I knew fear, but I was wrong. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This was going to be my biggest adventure yet. I thought facing death at an early age, because of the choices that I had made, was the scariest thing that I would ever encounter. I didn't want to die, so I changed my life. And to celebrate 2 years of getting healthy and losing weight, I wanted to do something extreme. So I chose a multi-day solo hike through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I was ready, and I knew the rules. Leave no trace, stick to the trails, and tell someone your plans. I thought I was prepared for anything the Smokies could throw at me. But there are things in Appalachia that no trail guide can prepare you for. There are rules, and if you break the rules, you might discover that some urban legends are better left in the dark. Because in Appalachia, the greatest danger isn't the wilderness. It's what's waiting for you within. Two years ago, I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without getting winded. Now, here I am, about to embark on a solo hike through the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. It felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. I had been overweight my whole life, and the older I got, the more miserable and depressed I was becoming. My doctors kept trying to warn me that my body wasn't going to be able to sustain this for much longer, which ended up making me feel more miserable and depressed. And I started waking up in the middle of the night with these overwhelming feeling of impending doom, like I was gonna die. And on my 39th birthday, something in my brain just snapped. I couldn't do this anymore. I had wasted half my life. Well, probably more than half my life, because I was gonna die pretty young if I didn't get my shit together. So I did it, and I managed to lose 100 pounds. And look, don't expect me to be able to give you some kind of magic secret. I don't even think I know what happened or what finally changed for me to be able to do it this time. Because at this point, I had tried everything and nothing worked. But for whatever reason, this just clicked. And it wasn't easy, that was for sure. I was about as far from an active person as you could possibly be. There were a lot of ups and downs, but the biggest challenge was finding some kind of exercise that I actually enjoyed and that was fun. But somewhere along the way, I did. I started hiking and I immediately fell in love with it. It was something about the peace and calm or the way I felt on the trails. And I loved the challenge of the terrain and just the way that hiking made me feel. I felt strong and capable for the first time in my life. So when it came time to celebrate my 2-year fitiversary, I wanted to celebrate with something extreme. Something that the old me would never have been able to do. Actually, something the old me would never even have considered doing. And I knew exactly what that was going to be. I had a work trip to Chattanooga, Tennessee that was about a month away. And I decided when we were done with all the work stuff for that week, I was going to rent a car and then drive down to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park to do this multi-day solo hike. This was gonna be epic because up until this point, I had never done anything more than a day hike. I planned everything meticulously. I got new hiking boots, top of the line gear, and enough supplies to last me for 3 days. And I told my family and friends my plan, my exact route, and when to expect me home. Look, I watch a lot of TV, and I know you're never supposed to go into the woods unless you let people know where you're going, and when to call the authorities if you don't return. So if anything, I was being overcautious. I felt ready, I felt prepared, and I felt confident. So we arrived in Chattanooga on Monday, and then all the work conference stuff ended by Wednesday. So my plan was to rent a car and then drive down to this small town that was located just outside the entrance of the park. And I was gonna stay the night to make sure that I was well rested and that I had enough supplies and was able to pick anything up that I might have forgot. And then I would hike Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then fly back home on Sunday. Easy peasy. Everything was lining up beautifully. So after a couple hours of driving, I made it to the town and then to the hotel I planned on staying at. It was perfect. It was cheap and it was just a short drive to the entrance of the park. And then next to the hotel was this cute little diner. So I decided to stop in and get something to eat and then check through my supplies to make sure that I had everything I needed before I headed out in the morning. And as I was checking through my supplies, I kind of noticed this older man looking at me, kind of like watching what I was doing. It was a little creepy. It's not like he was trying to hide it at all. And then we were at a point where I'm looking at him, he's looking at me, and then he finally says, "Hiking the Smokies, huh?" And I was just like, "Yeah, you got any words of wisdom for me?" So then he comes over to my table and he starts like eyeing my gear. And then he says, "Well, looks like you've got everything you need for the trip." And then he introduced himself as Alan, and Alan turned out to be a pretty cool guy. We talked for like 25 minutes about the Smokies. He was a retired park ranger. I showed him my route. He was really familiar with it. In fact, he had a lot of great suggestions for things I should stop and see along the way. And as we were chatting, I told him my story and how I ended up here. And he told me about his family and his time as a park ranger in the Smokies. It was a really nice chat. When I got up to leave, Alan, who had been very fun and sweet up until this point, suddenly got this look of concern on his face. And then he leans in and gestures for me to come closer. And he says really quietly, "You know the rules, right?" I was a little caught off guard. I mean, I had just talked to the man for about 25 minutes, all about my history, about my hiking experience, and yeah, I knew the rules. So I just kind of laughed and patted my back and said, "Yeah, leave no trace, stick to the trails. I've got it covered. I know how to stay safe in the woods." And this is where it got really weird. Alan got really serious and he says, "No, not those rules, the real rules. The ones that keep you safe in these woods." There was something about his tone that gave me pause. Like, what do you mean, the real rules? He leaned in closer, and his voice dropped really low, and he whispers to me, "Listen careful. This is important. Don't look up if the birds go quiet. You see something? No, you didn't. If you hear something? No, you didn't. Don't whistle after dark. And if you hear a whistle, whatever you do, do not whistle back." And I just kind of nodded. "Okay, Alan." I mean, I was unnerved, but I really wasn't trying to show it. I knew there was a lot of folklore and history in this area, so I kind of just chalked it up to local superstition and urban legends. I mean, Alan was an old man, probably a grandfather, probably a jokester, just trying to razzle me up, like, here's this tourist coming here to hike in our park. I mean, this is Appalachia. I'm not dumb. I've seen the TikToks and all the other social media posts, and apparently so had Ellen, but that stuff's not real. At least that's what I thought. I had brushed it off and actually completely forgot about it by the next morning. I was just so excited to get going on this adventure, and the first day and a half were glorious. The autumn colors were in full bloom, the air was crisp and invigorating, and I felt strong and alive, and it was hard. It was so much harder than I thought it was going to be. Hiking these trails was physically demanding, but The isolation was actually the part that was harder than I thought. I was having fun, but I noticed I was starting to feel lonely from time to time. It was crazy how alive the forest was. I mean, birds were chirping, little animals were scurrying about, big animals were trotting through the trees, and the leaves and the branches just swayed almost rhythmically as the wind blew through them. It was pretty cool. And it was actually kind of creepy how some of the birds actually sounded like people talking, but like from a distance. Or maybe it was people talking. I don't know. I didn't see anybody else on the trail. I think I'd only really passed a couple of people along the way at the beginning. At one point when I was hiking on the trail, getting close to the spot where I was going to camp for the second night, I noticed that there was a deer kind of flanking me through the trees, just like side by side with me as I'm walking. And when I would walk, he would walk. And when I would stop, he would stop. It was kind of like we were in sync. And I'm not an animal expert, but I'm pretty sure deer are skittish. So I just figured that it was really kind of freaked out by me and was trying to keep an eye on me to make sure I wasn't going to harm it in any way. But it just stayed next to me. And at one point, I kind of just stopped and turned to face it. It was about 15 or 20 yards away from me. And we just sat there and stared at each other for a very awkward amount of time. And I don't know if it was my newfound hippie essence or maybe the fact that I hadn't talked to anybody in a day and a half. But I figured I would just let it know that I wasn't going to hurt it and it could just keep on trucking. Have a good life, Bambi. So I said to it out loud, hey, don't worry, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm not gonna come anywhere near you. I won't bother you at all. And in return, if you could stop following me, that would be great. Like you're kind of creeping me out. And as soon as I said it, the whole mood changed. The deer didn't move, and I had lost channeling my inner Snow White. Like, I was no longer comfortable with this. And I actually started to feel like I wasn't talking to the deer, but like pleading or negotiating with it. Like, hey, get going. What are you doing? Aren't you supposed to be scared of me? And it just stood there and looked at me, almost like it was taking in what I was saying and considering it. But needless to say, it was not afraid of me at all. But I decided to just turn around and keep on walking. It was getting close to dark, and I wasn't about to be caught out here on the trail talking to a deer. And I'm pretty sure I've seen a YouTube video or something about a guy getting his ass handed to him by a deer, so I wasn't going to mess with it anymore. I didn't want to piss it off any more than I felt like I already had. So I hiked for about 30 more minutes before I finally ended up at the spot that I had chosen to camp at on the second night. And it wasn't anything special, just a small little campsite about 10 yards off the trail. Everything was well marked, and it was kind of this open area that was meant for camping, just nestled back in the trees. Just an area of flat dirt to set up the tent and get comfy for the night. And as I was setting up my camp and laying out my stuff, I couldn't help but feel this proud sense of accomplishment for how far I had come, both on the trail and in life. And I had just finished setting up my tent and taking in all of the nature sounds around me when I started to hear this bird song that I hadn't heard up until this point. It was pretty far off in the distance, but it just seemed off. It didn't seem right. And as I'm straining to hear it, I realize it's not a bird, it's a whistle. It's someone whistling. But I hadn't passed any other hikers. There's nobody on the trail. Like, I hope this isn't a person that's lost, that's like trying to get somebody's attention. And I know that people get lost and go missing here all the time. I mean, this is a really easy place to get lost in. So I quick shot a whistle back in the direction I thought it was coming from, and then I just waited to hear if they whistled back. And I was looking off in the direction I thought it was coming from, but it was getting dark. It was so hard to see through the trees. But after just about a second, I did spot somebody. Somebody was coming towards me through the trees. Hey, somebody was in trouble, and I saved the day. Can add that to my list of accomplishments. And I was starting to play scenarios in my mind, like how I was going to get them some food, maybe some water. Should we call authorities? Can I get them some help? Then I noticed they weren't getting any closer. In fact, they had just kind of stopped. And I was straining to get a better look, and I could see that this person, it was actually a really tall person, was just standing, like almost hiding behind a tree. You know, like where they're behind the tree and like their upper half is sticking out looking at you. Like, what the hell were they doing? Maybe I could see them, but they couldn't see me. And I was just about to whistle back when Alan's words came rushing back to me, and I instantly froze. Don't whistle after dark. And if you hear whistling, whatever you do, don't whistle back. I was holding my breath. I didn't know what to do. I mean, come on, this is just a superstition. This is clearly a human. I'm looking at a human, right? Right? And then the whistle came again, and it snapped me out of my daze. I took a deep breath. It was closer this time, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. The whistle was wrong. There was something not right about it. It didn't sound human. And that's when I realized everything had went silent. The leaves stopped rustling, the wind stopped blowing, the birds stopped chirping. Don't look up if the birds go silent. I fought every instinct in my body and kept my eyes on the ground. What was out there? I felt this innate sense of fear washing over me, like this sixth sense that was trying to warn me that whatever was out there standing behind that tree, it was not human. It may look human, but it's not. And there it was, like an old familiar friend I hadn't seen in years. That all too familiar feeling of impending doom just covered me like an icy blanket. I knew this feeling all too well. I was gonna die. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure that whatever was out there could hear it. And I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly lifted my eyes up from the ground and looked out into the direction this thing was in. But there was nothing there. It was getting dark now, and the light from the campfire was making it really difficult to see anything out in the darkness. I slowly backed up and got as close to the fire as I safely could. It was the only thing giving me any sort of feeling of calm at this point. And I knew that fires could keep predators away, but this wasn't an animal. At least I didn't think it was. After about a half an hour, nothing else had happened. No whistling, no movement, and still no noise other than the crackling of the campfire. I was starting to feel like I was overreacting. It's just urban legends. None of this stuff is real. I've been in the woods many times and nothing has happened. I finally started to relax a little bit, and I sat down in my camping chair facing the fire with my back to the woods. That was a huge mistake. And almost immediately I heard a loud thud on the ground next to me, and whatever it was so heavy I could actually feel it shake the ground. But I looked over and there's nothing there. I quickly opened my tent and grabbed the flashlight and started scanning the tree line, but I didn't see anything. Good God, am I so paranoid over an old man trying to scare a tourist with some stupid rules that I'm gonna give myself a heart attack? I sat back down, took a deep breath, and sunk back into my chair. And just as I did that, I happened to look over to my right, and I saw something on the ground. Not on the ground, but in the ground. So I shined my flashlight over there to get a better look, and I am instantly overcome with panic. There was a footprint in the dirt, and it was huge, like whatever it was giant and heavy. I got up and crouched down next to it to get a better look. I'd never seen anything like this before. It was human-shaped, but it looked like whatever it was had 6 or 7 long toes. And as I'm kneeling there, just trying to take in what I'm seeing, I feel it again. A large thud, and then another. And I could see in the dirt more footprints forming, as if whatever it was had been standing there the whole time, and now it was walking away and circling back towards me. I didn't think. I just ran. I left my tent. I left everything. I didn't care. I was overcome with this primal fear to just get the hell out of there and get away from whatever this was. But it wasn't going anywhere. As I'm running, I can hear it crashing through the trees behind me, and it was getting closer. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew if I stopped, it would only be a matter of seconds before this thing was on me. It was getting so dark I couldn't see a thing. I could only feel the stinging pain in my face and my arms from running through these branches. Please don't poke my eyes out. Please don't poke my eyes out. I need to be able to see. And out of nowhere, I burst out of the trees into this small clearing. And there in the middle of the clearing was this old rundown cabin. I didn't know if this was an old ranger's cabin. I didn't know if this was occupied or abandoned, if there was law enforcement or squatters in there. I didn't care. I only had a split second to decide what I was going to do. Do I face the unknown terror of who could possibly be in that cabin, or the very real threat of the thing chasing me through the woods? I chose the cabin, and I managed to get from the tree line to that cabin in what felt like a second. I sprinted to the front door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. And for a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the blood rushing and pulsing through my ears. And I didn't have time to calm down before I heard it, this low, guttural growl coming from outside the cabin. My blood turned to ice. I didn't know until that moment what the word petrified actually felt like. I couldn't move. I had my back pressed up against the door with all my might trying to keep this thing closed, as if I was going to be able to keep this creature from getting in here. The cabin was dark. The only light was the moon coming in through the grimy windows. And it took a minute, but as my eyes adjusted, I was able to make out an old furniture and a fireplace, a table, and a couple of chairs. There was not much in here, but there was no one here, and from the looks of it, there hadn't been anyone here for a very long time. And then this wave of sadness and disappointment kind of washed over me. There wasn't anybody here. There was nobody here that was going to help me. The growling eventually faded, but it was replaced by something so much worse. The slow, deliberate sound of long, sharp nails dragging along the outside cabin wall. I held my breath, trying to track its movements as it went around the cabin, And as it got closer to the window, I saw this huge, dark, shadowy figure. And it seemed like it was looking in the window, like it was trying to look in the window for me. I got this overwhelming feeling like this thing was trying to make me think that it was human. And even though I couldn't see any features, I knew this thing wasn't human. I knew it for sure. It only stayed at the window for about a minute before it continued dragging its long, what I can only imagine to be razor-sharp claws around the outside walls of the cabin. It almost seemed like this thing knew what it was doing. Like it was familiar with the cabin, and it knew where I was in the cabin. And whatever it was trying to do, it was deliberate. And each time it passed around the cabin, it felt like an eternity. But I didn't dare breathe too loud. I didn't dare move at all. My legs were trembling and they were almost getting weak from the effort of pushing up against this door, but I wasn't about to move. And as it passed by again, I got this scent in the air. It smelled like wet, musty, decaying fur and leaves, but like this underlying odor of sulfur, whatever it was making my stomach turn. And my mind was racing. Why wasn't it coming in? There wasn't even a lock on the door. It was almost like this thing was messing with me. There was no doubt in my mind that if it wanted to get in that cabin, it could. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, this creature lets out this horrible sound. It was almost like part roar, part scream. It was so loud and so close, I could feel it vibrating in my chest. So I clamped my hands over my ears and I squeezed my eyes shut. And when I opened them again, I realized the scratching had stopped. And the woods outside was silent. No growls, no wildlife, no nothing. Just eerie silence. I don't know how long I stood there, but I was so afraid to move until I was sure that it was gone. And it wasn't until I saw the first faint light of dawn come through the window that I stumbled over onto the floor. My legs gave out beneath me. I sat there. I didn't know what to do. And as the sun rose, I began to hear the birds chirping outside again, like nothing had happened. And I cautiously approached the window and looked outside, and there was no sign of the creature. And I looked around the cabin to see if I could find any kind of weapon, because I was leaving and I wasn't going to leave without a weapon. And there wasn't really anything in the cabin except for the metal poker for the fireplace, which was fine with me, so I walked over there and I grabbed it. And as I was turning away, I glanced up and saw a picture on the mantle. It was an old picture of a park ranger outside this cabin leaning up against a truck. There was something familiar about the ranger, though I couldn't place it. And then it hit me. That was Alan, the old man from the diner. He said he was a retired park ranger. This must have been his cabin. I felt like I was gonna puke. Did he know about this? Was he actually trying to warn me? I mean, he saw my map. He knew where I was gonna be. And I felt angry or betrayed. I wasn't even really sure at this point. And it took me several hours to find somebody that could help me. I finally came across a group of hikers on the trail who were able to call for help. When they got there, I told the park rangers that I had gotten lost. I was just too embarrassed to tell them what really happened. I told them where my camp was, and they drove me back there in one of their side-by-sides. I was wondering how I was going to explain these footprints to them, or how they were going to react seeing them. And when we made it back to camp, I was in total disbelief. There were no footprints, no sign of me losing my shit and running away. The campsite looked totally normal, like nothing had happened. I got out of there and I got on the first flight back home. But what was I going to tell everybody? They were going to ask me about this big epic adventure I was on. I never told anybody what happened. And sometimes I still wonder if I just imagined it all. Like, exhaustion and these campfire stories are just playing tricks with my mind. And there are plenty of nights when I lie awake in bed just replaying what happened over and over again. What was it? Did Alan know about it? I don't know if I'll ever be able to let this go. I still hike though, and I'm still very proud of my journey. But now I always go in groups and never overnight. And I will never whistle in the woods again. I thought I was prepared for anything the Smokies could throw at me. But there are things in Appalachia that no trail guide can prepare you for. And when you break the rules, you might just discover why some urban legends are better left in the dark. Because in Appalachia, the greatest danger isn't the wilderness. It's what's waiting for you within it.